It happened in seconds, but the silence that followed felt endless. The restaurant was packed that evening, every table filled, every chair pulled close, the low hum of conversation mixing with the clink of cutlery and soft music in the background. It was the kind of night restaurants dream of. Busy, profitable, alive. No one inside La Stella expected that this night would end up changing lives. A woman stood near the center of it all. Her name was Aisha Noor. She wasn't a waitress rushing between tables or a host greeting guests at the door. She was the head chef, the heart of the kitchen. After years of long hours, burns on her hands, and quiet persistence, she had earned that position through skill alone. Food critics praised her creativity. Regular customers came back because of her dishes. She blended classic Italian recipes with subtle, soulful flavors that told a deeper story, one of patience, discipline, and love. And yes, she wore her hijab proudly, even under the bright kitchen lights. Most nights passed without incident, a few curious looks here and there, a whisper now and then, but nothing that prepared her for what was about to happen. Table 7 had ordered the chef's special. A truffle pasta dish, prepared carefully, plated perfectly. Aisha brought it out herself, as she often did for special orders. She believed food should be served with respect, and she believed in standing behind her work. The man at the table looked polished. Expensive suit, confident posture. The kind of person used to being listened to. Aisha placed the plate gently in front of him and smiled. "Enjoy your meal, sir." The man's eyes moved, not to the food but to her headscarf, then to her face, then back to the plate. "You made this?" he asked. "Yeah," Aisha replied calmly. "I'm the head chef." He took one bite. Then everything changed. The fork hit the table with a sharp sound that cut through the room. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned. "This is disgusting," he said loudly. "I don't want food made by someone like you." The words landed heavier than the noise. Ayesha felt her chest tighten, but she didn't move. The restaurant manager hurried over, trying to calm the situation. But the man wasn't finished. He stood up, grabbed the plate, and before anyone could react, he threw it. Hot pasta, sauce, oil, straight at her face. The room went dead silent. No music, no chatter, no movement. Aisha stood there, sauce dripping from her hijab, her uniform stained, her hands shaking, not from pain but from the weight of the moment. 50 people watched, frozen, waiting for the reaction everyone expected. Anger, tears, a scene. But Aisha didn't scream, she didn't collapse, she didn't fight back. She took a slow breath. And in that breath, everything shifted. Because what she was about to do next was something no one in that room, and eventually no one watching online, would ever forget. For a moment after the food hit her face, Aisha Noor didn't move. Not because she was weak, but because she was choosing. The heat of the sauce still burned her skin. A few drops slid down onto the floor, leaving the dark stains against the white tiles. The entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion everyone believed was justified. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another diner slowly reached for their phone, unsure whether they were about to witness a meltdown or a lawsuit. Aisha wiped her face gently with the back of her hand. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost peaceful. She straightened her posture, adjusted her hijab without rushing, and lifted her eyes to meet the man's stare. There was no hatred in them. No fear, either. What people saw instead confused them. Calm, pure, unsettling calm. "I'm sorry you didn't enjoy the food, sir," she said quietly. A few gasps escaped from nearby tables. The man laughed, a short, cruel sound. "That's it? An apology?" Aisha nodded slightly. "Yes, an apology." She paused, then continued, her voice steady enough to be heard across the room without ever rising. "I'm sorry because you clearly didn't come here hungry. You came here carrying something much heavier." The man's smile faltered. "You threw food at me," she said, gesturing lightly to her stained uniform. "But food can be cleaned. What you're carrying inside you, that's harder." The manager stood frozen, unsure whether to interrupt. No one dared to move. Something had shifted in the room, and everyone felt it. The power was no longer where they expected it to be. Aisha went on. I cook with my hands, yes, but I also cook with my heart. Every dish I make carries intention, care, discipline, respect. That's not just how I was trained, it's how I was raised. She touched her chest lightly, then her hijab. This, she said, doesn't make me less capable. It reminds me to be patient when anger would be easier, to choose dignity when humiliation is loud. The man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Phones were fully raised now. No one was hiding it anymore. They knew instinctively that they were witnessing something rare, not drama, something deeper. Aisha turned slightly toward the manager. Please, she said, have the kitchen prepare a fresh plate for this gentleman. On the house. The room erupted, not in outrage but in applause. Chairs scraped back as people stood up. Hands clapped. A woman near the window wiped tears from her eyes. Someone shouted, "Respect!" Another voice echoed it. The sound filled the restaurant, swelling until it drowned out everything else. The man, the one who had thrown the plate, looked around as if waking from a dream. His face drained of color, his shoulders sagged. The confidence that had once wrapped around him like armor cracked and fell away. He sat down slowly. Then he put his face in his hands. And he began to cry. Not quietly, not politely. He cried the way people do when something breaks open inside them, when a door they've kept locked for years suddenly gives way. Aisha walked toward him without hesitation. She knelt beside his chair, ignoring the stains on her clothes, the eyes watching her every move. It's okay, she said softly. We all have days where our pain speaks louder than our kindness. He looked up at her, tears streaking his face. I don't deserve this, he whispered. Aisha offered a small, gentle smile. Maybe not, she replied. But mercy isn't about what we deserve. That's what makes it powerful. In that moment, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It had become a witness, and the story was only just beginning. The applause slowly faded, but the weight of the moment remained. No one returned to their meals. Forks rested untouched on plates. Glasses sat half-raised in frozen hands. Every person in La Stella felt it. This was no longer about a restaurant incident. Something deeper was unfolding, something raw and human. The man at table 7 still hadn't lifted his head. His shoulders shook as he tried and failed to steady his breathing. The polished confidence he had walked in with was gone, stripped away by a kindness he had not been prepared to face. Aisha remained beside him, silent now, giving him space. She understood something many people didn't. Sometimes healing begins not with words, but with being seen without judgment. After what felt like a long time, he finally looked up. His eyes were red. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. You don't know me, he said. You don't know what I've done. Aisha met his gaze calmly. You're right, she replied. I don't. But I don't need to know everything about you to treat you with respect. That sentence landed harder than any accusation ever could. He swallowed, then glanced around the room. Dozens of strangers were watching him now, not with anger, not with triumph, but with quiet attention. No one was laughing. No one was mocking him. For the first time that evening, he felt exposed in a way money and authority could not shield. My name is Richard, he said finally. The room stayed silent. My daughter, she stopped speaking to me 3 months ago. His hands trembled as he clasped them together. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself she was making a mistake, that she was embarrassing me. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping through his tears. But the truth is, I was terrified. Aisha listened without interrupting. She chose a faith I didn't understand, Richard continued. A faith I only knew through headlines and fear. When she told me she had converted, I didn't ask her why. I didn't ask her what she felt. I didn't listen. His voice cracked. I told her to leave. I said things no father should ever say to his child. Several people in the restaurant looked down at their tables. A woman near the door pressed her hand to her mouth. Tonight, Richard said, when I saw you standing there wearing that scarf, speaking with confidence, I didn't see a stranger. I saw her. He turned to Aisha, shame flooding his face. And instead of facing my guilt, I turned it into anger. I thought if I could hurt you, maybe I could silence the part of me that knows I was wrong. Aisha felt a quiet ache in her chest, not for herself but for the daughter she had never met. She's not lost, Aisha said gently. Not to you, not to herself. Richard looked at her, disbelief etched into his expression. How can you be so sure? Because love doesn't disappear when someone chooses a different path, Aisha replied. It waits, and it hopes, and it prays, even when it's pushed away. She hesitated for a moment, then added, If she's anything like the women I know who walk this path, she's thinking about you more than you realize. The room felt smaller now, closer. People leaned in, drawn by the quiet power of the exchange. Richard wiped his face with his sleeve. I don't know anything about her faith, he admitted. All I know is that it took her from me. Ayesha shook her head slowly. No, she said. It didn't take her from you. Fear did. The words hung in the air, heavy but honest. For the first time that night, Richard nodded. And in that nod, something fragile but real began to change. Because anger had finally spoken its truth. And once truth is spoken, it can no longer hide behind hate. The restaurant no longer felt like a restaurant. It felt like a room suspended in time. No one was eating. No one was talking. The soft background music that usually filled La Stella had been turned off at some point, though no one remembered who did it. What remained was a quiet so deep it carried weight, a silence shaped by honesty, regret, and something unfamiliar to many people in the room. Accountability. Richard sat with his elbows on the table now, his head no longer buried in his hands. His breathing had slowed, though his eyes were still glassy. Across from him, the untouched fresh plate of pasta sat steaming gently. Forgotten. He hadn't even looked at it. I used to think strength meant control, he said after a long pause. Being right. Being obeyed. He gave a humorless smile. I built my whole life around that idea. Aisha remained standing nearby, not looming, not retreating, simply present. She had learned long ago that true confidence didn't need to dominate space. I taught my daughter to speak her mind, Richard continued, to think for herself. And when she finally did, I punished her for it. The irony of his words seemed to strike him all at once. His shoulders sagged. Aisha spoke carefully. Sometimes the hardest test isn't raising strong children, she said. It's accepting that their strength won't always look the way we imagined. Around them, people shifted in their seats. A man near the bar nodded slowly as if the words had reached him personally. A young couple held hands tighter. Richard exhaled deeply. When I walked in tonight, I was already angry, he admitted. Not at you, not at the food, at myself. He gestured weakly toward Aisha's stained uniform. But it was easier to turn that anger outward, easier to pick a target. The manager stepped forward instinctively, ready to step in, but Aisha raised her hand gently. Not now. This moment needed space. You didn't see a chef, Richard said quietly. You saw a reminder. Aisha nodded once. And reminders can be painful. Something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. People weren't watching out of curiosity anymore. They were listening because they recognized pieces of themselves in the conversation. Regrets they hadn't faced, words they wished they could take back, doors they had closed too quickly. A woman near the back whispered, "This is real." Her friend nodded, wiping her eyes. Richard looked around, finally seeing the room, not as an audience, but as witnesses. His voice trembled. I don't know how to fix this. Aisha's answer came without hesitation. You don't fix it all at once. She gestured toward the plate in front of him. You start by staying, by listening, by choosing humility over pride, even when it's uncomfortable. Richard stared at the plate for a moment, then slowly picked up his fork. His hands still shook, but he took a bite, not out of hunger, but acceptance. A small, collective breath moved through the room. After a few moments, he set the fork down. Can I ask you something? He said to Aisha. Of course. Where does that kind of patience come from? He asked. Because I know myself. If our positions were reversed, I don't think I would have handled this the way you did. Aisha considered the question carefully. It comes from knowing that reacting isn't the same as winning, she said. And that dignity doesn't need permission. She paused, then added softly, and from faith that teaches you that how you treat others matters, especially when they don't deserve kindness. The words landed gently but firmly. Richard nodded, absorbing them. For the first time since he had walked into the restaurant, his posture changed. Not defensive, not aggressive, but open. And something else changed too. The crowd no longer felt like strangers. They felt like participants in something rare. A moment where anger didn't get the final word and humility stepped forward instead. No one knew it yet, but what was unfolding in that room was already moving beyond those walls, quietly, invisibly, toward a future none of them could have predicted. Time moved strangely after that. Minutes passed, yet it felt as if the world outside La Stella had stopped existing. The streetlights beyond the windows glowed softly. Cars moved past. People laughed somewhere far away. But inside the restaurant, every heartbeat seemed synchronized around one table. Richard sat quietly, staring at his hands. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about how to defend himself, how to justify his actions, or how to regain control of the situation. Those instincts had burned out. What remained was something far more uncomfortable and far more honest. Curiosity, not the kind driven by argument or pride, but the kind that comes when a person realizes they might be wrong. He looked up at Aisha again. "You said something earlier," he began slowly. "About faith. About patience." She nodded. "Yes?" "I've spent months telling myself that my daughter was brainwashed," he admitted. "That she'd been manipulated into believing something dangerous, but standing here tonight," he gestured vaguely between them. "This doesn't look like danger." The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They carried weight simply because of where they came from. Aisha felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a confession. It was a doorway. "What does it teach her?" Richard asked. "Her faith? What does it give her that I couldn't?" A few people nearby leaned in without realizing it. The restaurant manager stood back, arms crossed, watching history quietly unfold. Aisha chose her words carefully. "It teaches her discipline," she said. "Responsibility. That her actions matter even when no one is watching. That kindness isn't weakness. That patience isn't surrender." Richard swallowed. "And forgiveness?" he asked. Aisha met his eyes. "Forgiveness is central. Not because it excuses harm, but because it frees the person carrying it." The man nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were aligning in his mind. "I thought forgiveness meant letting someone win," he said. "Letting them get away with hurting you." Aisha shook her head. "No," she replied gently. "It means choosing not to let their worst moment define your future." Silence followed, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Richard glanced around the restaurant again, at the people who had watched him unravel, at the woman who should have despised him but didn't, at the room that had transformed into something like a sanctuary. "Can I ask you something else?" he said. Aisha nodded. "Would she forgive me?" he asked. "My daughter." The question trembled as it left his mouth. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't defensive. It was the question of a father who finally understood what he had risked losing. Aisha felt her chest tighten. "I can't answer for her," she said honestly. "But I can tell you this. Faith didn't teach her to stop loving you. It taught her to hope." Richard closed his eyes, absorbing the words. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he opened them again and said something no one in the room expected. Would you tell me about it?" he asked. "Not to argue, not to debate, just to understand?" Aisha didn't smile widely. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded. "Yes," she said, I can do that." The relief on Richard's face was immediate and unmistakable. It wasn't joy. It wasn't certainty. It was the quiet relief of someone who had finally stopped running from a question they were afraid to ask. Phones were still recording, but no one felt intrusive anymore. What they were capturing wasn't drama, it was transformation in its earliest, most fragile form. Richard took a deep breath. "Then maybe," he said softly, "this night wasn't about anger at all." Aisha agreed. "Sometimes," she replied, "the loudest anger is just grief asking to be heard." Outside, the city kept moving, unaware. Inside, a door had opened, and once opened, it would never fully close again. Aisha checked the clock above the bar and realized how much time had passed. Her shift had officially ended nearly an hour ago, yet no one had asked her to leave. The kitchen staff lingered instead of clocking out. The manager had quietly placed a closed sign on the door, turning away late customers without explanation. Whatever was happening inside La Stella felt more important than business. Richard noticed the clock too. I don't want to keep you, he said, guilt flickering across his face. You've already given me more than I deserve tonight. Aisha shook her head. Some conversations don't follow schedules, she replied, and some moments are meant to be finished properly. She pulled a chair and sat across from him, no longer a chef standing beside a customer, but two human beings meeting on equal ground. Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. I spent my life believing that faith was something people used when they couldn't handle reality, he admitted. A crutch. An excuse. He looked at her honestly now, without bitterness. But what I saw tonight wasn't weakness. Aisha listened, her hands folded calmly on the table. I saw restraint, he continued. I saw discipline. I saw someone who could have destroyed me and chose not to. Aisha responded quietly. Faith isn't about escaping reality, she said. It's about being accountable to it, especially when it's uncomfortable. Richard nodded, absorbing every word. My daughter tried to explain that, he said. I never let her finish a sentence. Aisha didn't correct him. She didn't judge him. She simply allowed the truth to exist between them. What does it ask of you? Richard asked. Your faith. What does it demand on nights like this? Aisha thought for a moment. It asks me to remember that every person is fighting something invisible, she said, and that my behavior is a reflection of who I answer to, not who provoked me. Richard smiled faintly. That sounds exhausting. It can be, Aisha admitted, but it's also freeing. She leaned forward slightly. Because once you understand that your dignity doesn't depend on winning an argument, you stop being controlled by other people's anger. The words settled deeply. Richard stared at the table, tracing a small crack in the wood with his finger. I wish I had understood that sooner, he said. I might still have my daughter at my dinner table. You still can, Aisha replied. Tables aren't fixed places. They can be rebuilt. Something in Richard's expression shifted. Hope? Tentative and fragile. Does she pray for me? He asked quietly. Aisha answered without hesitation. Yes. How can you be so sure? Because love doesn't shut down overnight, she said. And faith doesn't teach abandonment. It teaches patience. Richard's eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't fall. He wiped them away and laughed softly, embarrassed. I came in here tonight thinking I'd found proof that I was right, he said. Instead, I found proof that I was afraid. Aisha smiled, not triumphantly, but kindly. Fear is loud, she said, but it's not permanent. Around them, the staff quietly resumed small movements, stacking chairs, wiping counters, giving the conversation space while staying close. The restaurant felt warm, almost intimate, as if the walls themselves were listening. Richard straightened in his chair. If I wanted to start over, he said carefully, not with my daughter yet, but with understanding, where would I begin? Aisha met his gaze, recognizing the weight of the question. You begin by listening, she said. Not to argue, not to defend, just to listen. He nodded slowly. And then? He asked. Aisha smiled gently. Then you asked the questions you were afraid to ask before. Richard took a deep breath, steadied himself, and spoke. Can you tell me, he said, what my daughter found? The room felt still again, but this time the stillness carried promise because this wasn't the end of the night. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Richard held his phone in his hand, staring at the screen as if it might burn him. The device felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the weight of the metal or glass, it was the weight of what it represented. 3 months. 3 months of silence. 3 months of unanswered messages, unsent apologies, and nights spent convincing himself that distance was easier than humility. Aisha noticed his hesitation. You don't have to do anything tonight, she said gently. Understanding doesn't demand urgency. Richard nodded, but his fingers tightened around the phone. I know, he replied. But if I don't do this now, I might talk myself out of it again. He exhaled slowly and unlocked the screen. The name was still there. He hadn't deleted it, hadn't blocked it. Some part of him, buried beneath pride and anger, had kept that door cracked open, just enough to let regret slip through. I don't even know what to say, he admitted. What if she doesn't answer? Aisha leaned back slightly, giving him space while remaining present. Then you'll still have taken a step, she said. Silence doesn't erase effort. Richard nodded. His thumb hovered, trembling slightly before finally pressing the call button. The ringing echoed louder than it should have in the quiet restaurant. One ring, two, three. Several people nearby had stopped pretending not to watch. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had agreed, without words, that this moment mattered. Then the ringing stopped. Hello? Her voice came through the speaker, cautious and distant. Richard closed his eyes. For a second, he couldn't speak. It's Dad, he said finally, his voice breaking. I don't know if you want to hear from me, but... Dad? She interrupted softly. That single word undid him. I'm sorry, he said, the words spilling out before fear could stop them. I'm so sorry. I didn't listen. I was wrong. I hurt you, and there's no excuse for that. He paused, swallowing hard. I don't want to argue anymore. I don't want to control you. I want to understand. And I want you in my life, if you'll let me try again. There was silence on the other end. Aisha watched his face carefully, the tension in his jaw, the way his breath caught, the quiet desperation in his eyes. She knew this kind of silence. It wasn't rejection. It was someone deciding whether to trust hope again. I never stopped loving you, the voice on the phone said at last. I just didn't know if you wanted me anymore. Richard's shoulders sagged as if a weight had been lifted. Tears slid down his face, unchecked. I do, he said. I always did. I just didn't know how to say it. They spoke quietly for several minutes. Nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed. Simple words, honest pauses, a promise to meet, a promise to talk again soon. When the call ended, Richard lowered the phone slowly, as though afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. The restaurant remained silent until someone near the back began to clap. Then another, and another. Not loudly, not wildly, just enough to say, "We saw this." Richard wiped his face and let out a shaky laugh. I don't deserve this night, he said to Aisha, or any of you. Aisha shook her head gently. Deserving isn't the point, she replied. Choosing is. He looked at her with gratitude so raw it hurt to witness. You changed my life tonight, he said. Aisha smiled softly. No, she corrected. You changed it when you decided to face the truth. Outside, the city lights flickered as usual, unaware of the quiet reconciliation that had just taken place. Inside La Stella, a man who had come in, fueled by anger, sat transformed. Not finished, not perfected, but finally, honestly, on the path back to love. And the story still wasn't over. When Richard finally stood to leave La Stella, the night felt different. Not lighter, more honest. He shook hands with the manager, thanked the staff one by one, and turned to Aisha with a hesitation that felt almost shy. I don't know how to say thank you without making it smaller than it is, he said. Aisha smiled. Then don't try to summarize it, she replied. Just live it. He nodded, committing the words to memory, and stepped out into the city air. What Richard didn't see was what happened after the door closed behind him. Phones that had been recording quietly all night were now uploading. Short clips, his tears, Aisha's calm voice, the applause, began appearing online within minutes. Captions varied, but the message didn't. This is what dignity looks like. This is how hate breaks. Watch till the end. By the time Aisha reached home and washed the last traces of sauce from her uniform, the video had already crossed hundreds of thousands of views. By morning, it was everywhere. Strangers sent messages to the restaurant. Comment sections filled with debates, praise, reflection. Some people argued. Others confessed they had once been like Richard. Many simply wrote that they had cried watching a woman respond to cruelty with grace. Aisha didn't read most of it. She returned to work as usual, tying her apron, stepping into the kitchen, focusing on the rhythm she knew so well. Fame had never interested her. Purpose had. 2 days later, Richard returned. Not with anger, not with shame, with questions. He sat at the valet counter this time, not demanding a table, not seeking attention. When Aisha stepped out, he stood politely. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said. You're not, she replied. They spoke during her break, quietly, away from cameras and crowds. Richard didn't ask about rules or rituals first. He asked about meaning. What does it give people when everything else falls apart? He asked. Why would someone choose it when it costs them so much? Aisha answered honestly. Because sometimes losing what you expect is how you find what you need. Richard absorbed that in silence. He returned again the following week and the week after that. Each time he asked a little more about discipline, about prayer, about humility, about how belief shapes behavior when no one is watching. He listened more than he spoke. He challenged assumptions he'd held for decades and allowed them to change. One evening, he brought a small notebook. I started writing things down, he admitted. Questions, thoughts, things I don't want to forget. Aisha smiled. That's how learning begins. He hesitated, then added, My daughter is coming with me next time. True to his word, she did. When she walked into the restaurant beside him, her posture was cautious, guarded by experience. She didn't rush forward, she didn't accuse. She simply stood, watching her father, really watching him, for the first time in months. Richard introduced her softly. This is Aisha, he said, the woman I told you about. Her daughter met Aisha's eyes, recognition flickering across her face. Gratitude followed. They didn't need many words. Some understanding doesn't. From that night on, the three of them met often, not always at the restaurant, sometimes for walks, sometimes for coffee. Conversations flowed slowly, honestly. No pressure, no urgency, just space. Weeks passed. Then, one evening, Richard arrived alone. He looked different. Calmer? Steadier? I borrowed a book, he said, placing it gently on the table between them. I wanted to read it myself, without commentary. Aisha nodded, recognizing the weight of the gesture. And? She asked. Richard took a deep breath. I think, he said slowly, I'm starting to understand why my daughter didn't lose herself. He looked up at Aisha, eyes clear. She found herself. The night that had once been fueled by anger had refused to stay quiet. It had grown, and it was still growing. Richard didn't sleep much that night. The book lay open on his bedside table, its pages marked with folded corners and penciled notes in the margins. He had promised himself he wouldn't rush, wouldn't turn curiosity into performance. But something inside him had already crossed a line. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. The kind that changes how you see yourself. He read slowly, not searching for arguments to win or flaws to expose, but for understanding. Passages that once would have triggered resistance now stirred recognition. Words about responsibility, humility, and mercy echoed conversations he had lived, not just read. In the early hours before dawn, he closed the book and sat in silence. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of being wrong. He met Aisha again a few days later, this time asking for nothing except clarity. I don't want to borrow your words, he said. I want to know if this path asks me to become someone honest or someone else entirely. Aisha considered him carefully. It doesn't ask you to erase who you are, she said. It asks you to be accountable for who you choose to be. They talked about intention, about repairing harm without demanding instant forgiveness, about discipline that reshapes daily choices rather than grand gestures. Richard listened with a seriousness that surprised even him. That evening, he called his daughter. I'm not asking you to guide me, he said. I just want you to know I'm learning, and I'm sorry it took me so long. She didn't celebrate, she didn't push. She simply said, Thank you for telling me. It was enough. Weeks passed, the conversations continued. Richard volunteered his time where he could, not to prove anything, but to ground himself in service. He learned to sit with discomfort, to let questions remain open without forcing answers. He stopped speaking over people, stopped assuming authority meant certainty. One afternoon, he returned to La Stella with a small wrapped package. He placed it on the counter between himself and Aisha. I don't know how to say this without making it sound like a conclusion, he said, but it isn't one. Aisha waited. I've decided, he continued slowly, to commit. Not to a moment, not to an apology, but to a way of living that demands I be better than my anger. He unwrapped the package. Inside was a small book. Simple. Worn already from use, Aisha recognized it immediately. I didn't arrive here because of an argument, Richard said. I arrived here because someone showed me restraint when cruelty would have been easier, because forgiveness exposed my fear instead of feeding it. His voice steadied. I'm choosing this path because it asks me to repair what I broke and to protect what I almost lost. Aisha felt emotion rise, but she kept her composure. Then understand this, she said. This choice isn't a shield, it's a responsibility. Richard nodded. I'm ready for that. The announcement didn't come with applause, no cameras, no spectacle, just quiet resolve. A few days later, he stood beside his daughter in a modest room, shoulders squared, eyes clear. There were no speeches, only intentions spoken plainly, sincerely. His daughter's hand trembled as she reached for his. Not from doubt, but from relief. Afterward, they walked together in the evening air. I didn't think this would ever happen, she said softly. Neither did I, he replied. But I'm grateful it did. When Richard returned to the restaurant weeks later, he wasn't the man who had thrown a plate. He was the man who stacked chairs without being asked, who listened more than he spoke, who thanked people without needing to be seen. He stood once more in the room where his life had turned. And this time, he understood what had really happened that night. He hadn't been defeated. He had been invited to choose differently. And he had said yes. Months later, La Stella looked the same from the outside. The same warm light spilled onto the sidewalk in the evenings. The same familiar aroma drifted through the doors. Regular customers still came for the food, still praised the flavors, still asked for the chef's special. To anyone passing by, it was just another successful restaurant in a busy city. But inside, something invisible had changed. Aisha Noor still worked the same long hours. She still tied her apron the same way, still checked every plate before it left the kitchen, still treated food as a responsibility rather than a performance. She never spoke about that night unless someone asked, and even then, she spoke softly, without drama. To her, it wasn't a miracle, it was a choice. Richard returned often. Not as a headline, not as a spectacle, but as a man rebuilding his life one decision at a time. Sometimes he came alone. Sometimes his daughter walked beside him, more relaxed now, her smile easier, her posture no longer guarded. They didn't sit at the important tables. They sat where space was available, grateful rather than entitled. They volunteered together on weekends, serving meals to people who rarely felt seen. Richard learned quickly that service had a way of dissolving pride. No one there cared who he used to be. They cared how he treated them now. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, Aisha stood near the kitchen doorway watching the staff finish cleaning. On the wall nearby hung a framed photograph, a simple one. 3 people stood side by side, smiling quietly. Not posed, not polished, just present. Beneath it was a short line, handwritten and modest. Respond to harm with what is better. No explanation, no signature. A new employee once asked Aisha what the photo meant. She smiled and said, "It reminds me to stay steady." That was all. The internet moved on as it always does, ease. New stories replaced old ones. New outrage demanded attention. But every so often, someone would recognize Aisha and thank her, not for changing a man's beliefs, but for showing them how dignity looks under pressure. She always responded the same way. I didn't change anyone, she would say. I just refused to let anger decide my behavior. Richard understood that now. The night he had walked into the restaurant filled with rage no longer haunted him. It instructed him. It reminded him of the version of himself he never wanted to become again. When frustration rose, when fear whispered old habits back into his mind, he remembered the silence after the plate hit the floor, and the calm that followed. He remembered that forgiveness had confronted him more powerfully than punishment ever could. Aisha understood something else too. Standing firm didn't require shouting. Faith didn't require performance. Strength didn't need an audience. Sometimes it only required restraint. Life continued, as it always does, uneven, imperfect, demanding. But something had shifted in the lives connected by that night. Not dramatically, not magically, durably. A father learned how to listen. A daughter reclaimed a relationship without surrendering herself. A woman proved, to herself more than anyone else, that dignity can exist even in humiliation. And a room full of strangers witnessed what happens when someone chooses principle over impulse. No one left that night unchanged. Some carried the lesson quietly. Some forgot it quickly. But for those who remembered, the message stayed clear. Hate doesn't end by being louder. It ends when someone refuses to echo it. That is what remained after the applause faded. Not a viral moment, a way forward.